The 19th century was a transformative period that shaped global and Philippine society. Revolutions, liberal ideas, and social changes defined the time, creating an environment that influenced Jose Rizal's nationalistic ideals. Hello, everyone. I am Amelia. Today, we will take a deep dive into the world of the 19th century, the era that shaped Jose Rizal's thoughts and ideals. Understanding this historical context allows us to see how Rizal's thoughts and actions were shaped by his era and the development of Filipino nationalistic identity. To understand Rizal's nationalism, we must first examine the major global changes that shaped the world during his time. The 19th century was a period of political upheaval, intellectual awakening, and movements for freedom, all of which influenced Filipino thinkers like Rizal. 1. Rise of liberalism and nationalism in Europe. During the 19th century, Europe experienced a wave of liberal revolutions that sought freedom from monarchies and colonial rule. The French Revolution 1789 championed ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, which inspired nationalist movements worldwide. The unification of Italy 1861 and Germany 1871 demonstrated how oppressed peoples could fight for independence and establish their own nations. These movements influenced Rizal and his contemporaries by showing that colonial subjects could overthrow oppressive rulers. Rizal's works, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, echo the principles of self-determination and national identity. 2. Anti-colonial movements and revolutions. Having seen the impact of European liberalism, we now turn to how global anti-colonial movements inspired Rizal and his contemporaries. Across the Americas, colonies fought for independence from European rule. The American Revolution 1776 and Latin American Wars of Independence early 1800s weakened Spain's global power. The Meiji Restoration in Japan 1868 showcased an Asian nation's ability to modernize and resist Western influence. These revolutions provided a model for resistance against colonial rule. Rizal admired Japan's modernization and viewed it as an example of Asian empowerment. (3) Influence of liberal thinkers and the Enlightenment. Having examined the revolutionary movements, we now focus on the intellectual inspirations behind Rizal's ideals. Philosophers such as John Locke, Voltaire, and Rousseau championed freedom, democracy, and human rights. The works of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and Victor Hugo's Les Miserables exposed social injustices, influencing Rizal's writing style and reformist ideals. Rizal's Noli Me Tangere was heavily inspired by these works. His essays and speeches reflected Enlightenment principles advocating for education, reason, and civil rights. The socio-cultural transformations of the 19th century played a crucial role in shaping nationalistic movements across the world, including in the Philippines. The rise of liberalism and nationalism in Europe, the wave of anti-colonial revolutions, and the influence of Enlightenment thinkers all contributed to a global shift towards self-determination and individual rights. These ideas resonated with Filipino intellectuals like Jose Rizal, who saw the need to challenge colonial oppression and advocate for reforms. Now that we understand the global forces influencing Rizal, we now examine how local inequalities fueled Filipino nationalism. These internal struggles fueled Rizal's nationalistic fervor. 1. Rigid social stratification and racial discrimination. Philippine society was divided into Peninsulares Spaniards born in Spain, Insulares Spaniards born in the Philippines, Mestizos, and Indios. Native Filipinos. Spaniards held the highest positions in government and the church, while Filipinos had limited rights. With this rigid social stratification, Indios were treated as low-class citizens under Spanish rule, with limited access to education and employment. Rizal, despite being a mestizo, faced racial discrimination. His experiences shaped his advocacy for equal rights, education, and political reforms. 2. Theocentric society. Another socio-cultural change that influenced Rizal's nationalistic character was the theocentric society of the 19th century Philippines. This change played a crucial role in shaping Rizal's nationalist ideals. Under Spanish rule, the Catholic Church not only controlled religious life but also dominated education and governance. The friars dictated what was taught in schools, ensuring that Filipinos remained submissive and unaware of their own rights. This deep entanglement of the church in state affairs led to widespread corruption, abuse of power, and the oppression of Filipino secular priests, as seen in the execution of the Gomburza. Rizal, who was educated in both the Philippines and Europe, recognized the dangers of this system and strongly opposed friar dominance. His novels, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, exposed the injustices of the Church, portraying how it manipulated both the government and the people. His call for educational reforms and the separation of church and state was a direct response to this oppressive theocratic rule, reinforcing his vision of a nation that was intellectually liberated and governed by reason rather than blind faith. The Church's control over education and governance fueled his opposition to religious oppression. Three. Bahay na Bato. Considering the emergence of the Bahay na Bato, or stonehouse, is another socio-cultural change that has an impact with Rizal and Filipino nationalism. The Bahay na Bato symbolized the economic progress of the Filipino elite, but it also highlighted the deepening social divide between the privileged and the poor. The construction of these large, European-style homes was made possible by the wealth acquired through agriculture, trade, and government positions under Spanish rule. However, only the ilustrados, educated and wealthy Filipinos, could afford such homes, while the majority of Indios, common Filipinos, continued to live in nipa huts. Rizal, despite coming from an ilustrado family, did not turn a blind eye to the widening class gap. Instead, he used his writings to criticize the complacency of the elite, urging them to use their influence for the greater good. His patriotism was not just about resisting Spanish rule but also about advocating for an inclusive national identity, one where Filipinos, regardless of social class, would have access to education and opportunities for advancement. The economic divide symbolized by the Bahay na Bato pushed him to advocate for social justice. 4. Abecedario. The introduction of the Abecedario Spanish alphabet marked a significant shift in Filipino literacy and socio-cultural identity. While it facilitated learning and communication under Spanish rule, it also led to the gradual erasure of indigenous writing systems, such as the Baybayin. By imposing a foreign script, the Spaniards ensured that Filipino culture was further intertwined with their colonial rule, making it easier to instill loyalty to Spain. Rizal, as a passionate advocate for education and history, saw the loss of indigenous scripts as a reflection of cultural colonization. He believed that reclaiming Filipino identity required an awareness of pre-colonial heritage. In his essay The Philippines a Century Hence, he warned against forgetting one's roots, and in El Filibusterismo, he emphasized the need for intellectual empowerment through education. By writing in both Spanish and Tagalog, Rizal demonstrated the power of language in shaping national consciousness, inspiring later generations to reclaim Filipino identity through literature and education. The Abecedarios' imposition awakened his awareness of cultural identity and the importance of historical preservation. '5. Secularization and the martyrdom of the Gomburza. Having understood the impact of the Abecedarios' imposition to Rizal's patriotism, we now analyze the Church's power in the Philippines. The secularization movement and the martyrdom of Gomburza were crucial in awakening Jose Rizal's nationalist ideals and shaping the broader Filipino struggle for independence. The fight for secularization exposed Spanish racial discrimination and oppression, while the execution of Fathers Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora in 1872 became a symbol of colonial injustice. Deeply moved by their sacrifice, Rizal saw education, enlightenment, and unity as essential tools for reform, later dedicating El Filibusterismo to their memory. Their unjust deaths fueled Filipino resistance, inspiring the propaganda movement and the call for national sovereignty. Ultimately, the Gomburza's martyrdom transformed the fight for religious equality into a broader nationalist awakening, reinforcing Rizal's commitment to justice, dignity, and the pursuit of freedom. 6. Spanish educational system. The Spanish educational system in the Philippines played a dual role in shaping Rizal's patriotism and Filipino nationalism. On one hand, it was heavily controlled by the Catholic Church, prioritizing religious instruction over intellectual growth, limiting access to higher education, and restricting the teaching of liberal ideas. This system fostered ignorance and submission, reinforcing colonial oppression. On the other hand, it also created an elite class of educated Filipinos, including Rizal, who gained access to higher learning, particularly in Europe, where they were exposed to liberal and nationalist ideals. Rizal's education allowed him to recognize the injustices of Spanish rule, inspiring him to use his writings, particularly Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo, to advocate for reforms and awaken national consciousness. By highlighting the flaws of the Spanish educational system, Rizal emphasized education as a tool for liberation, proving that knowledge and critical thinking were essential in the fight for Filipino identity, equality, and independence. The rigid social stratification, cultural shifts, racial discrimination, and the dominance of the Catholic Church in governance and education in the Philippines reinforced the urgency of change. These socio-cultural changes inspired Rizal and other reformists to demand national identity, equality, and sovereignty. The 19th century was a time of great global and local changes. The rise of liberalism, revolutions, and intellectual movements shaped Rizal's understanding of nationalism. In the Philippines, social stratification, frailocracy, and racial discrimination fueled his desire for reform. By analyzing Rizal's context, we recognize how individuals like him respond to their historical circumstances, shaping national identity. We have now seen how Rizal's nationalism was shaped by the socio-cultural conditions of his time. Understanding these historical contexts helps us appreciate his contributions and how they continue to inspire us today. Thank you for watching.